She's a lot more practiced at it and has shown it a lot more.
We feel their absence at every familiar turn of the season.
For decades, silence protected him. But in one quiet, devastating moment, King Charles finally spoke the words no one thought he ever would, shattering his family and the nation. It began in a room where history itself seemed to hold its breath. The walls had witnessed coronations, councils, and quiet betrayals, but nothing like this. Behind those closed doors, King Charles sat across from his sons, the weight of his crown heavy, but the weight of his regret heavier. William and Harry, two men shaped by the same tragedy, yet divided by different choices, watched him with eyes that demanded truth. And at last, Charles gave it to them. His voice cracked, yet the words were unmistakable. I never truly tried to save that marriage. The silence that followed was sharper than any accusation. William's gaze locked onto his father's, cold and unyielding, a stare that spoke of wounds that had never healed. His jaw tightened, his posture rigid, but he said nothing. To speak would have been to betray how much it hurt. Harry, sitting opposite him, didn't look away either. But his response was different, a clenched fist, a jaw taut, with the kind of restrained fury only someone betrayed could carry. There were no tears. That grief had long since calcified into something colder, something harder. Across the room, Camila stood motionless. For years she had worked quietly, diligently to recast her image, to step out from Diana's long shadow and into the light of acceptance. But in that instant, as Charles's words settled over the room like ash, she realized she would never truly escape that ghost. Diana's name, her presence, her pain, it was still written in the hearts of her sons and now confessed by their father. And so it was done. Behind palace walls, a secret was finally spoken. One that should have brought release, but instead, it set into motion something far greater, a reckoning that no crown could shield him from. But this confession wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a storm no crown could weather. The confession hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear. And in the silence that followed, everything changed forever. William's gaze cut through the room like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. There was no need for words, because his eyes said everything. A deep hurt wrapped in quiet fury, an unspoken accusation that echoed louder than any confrontation could have. He did not flinch, did not even blink. He simply stared at his father as though trying to burn the moment into memory, to make sure Charles knew just how much he had failed him, failed her, failed them all. That look was not just disappointment, it was a wound being split open again, the kind that never truly heals, only scars. Harry too sat in silence, but his silence was different. If William's quiet was icy, Harry's was a volcanic, hardened exterior, struggling to contain the anger boiling underneath. His jaw clenched, his fists curling tighter with every passing second, until his knuckles whitened. His grief had been buried long ago, replaced by something colder, something sharper, and yet in that moment it threatened to erupt. There was no forgiveness in his silence, only judgment. And Camila, she froze. For years she had worked tirelessly to claw her way out of the shadows, to convince a skeptical nation that she belonged. Every carefully orchestrated photo, every calculated smile, every painstaking charity event, all of it now lay in ruins in her mind. As Charles's words echoed in the room, she could feel the years of effort collapsing around her. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that no amount of time, no amount of effort, could erase Diana from the hearts of those two men, or from the memory of the public. Across from them, Charles sat visibly shaken, his hands trembling ever so slightly, his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of his confession was crushing him where he sat. It was not just the words he had spoken that rattled him, but what he saw reflected in his sons' faces, the raw disappointment, the betrayal, the quiet disgust. In that moment, he understood that the truth he thought might set him free had instead unshackled a darker reality, one where he could never truly undo the harm, never truly repair the fractures he had caused. The monarchy, that grand and ancient institution he had been raised to protect, now felt fragile in his hands, like fine glass on the edge of shattering. For the first time, he saw not just his own failures, but the possibility that everything they stood for might crumble under the weight of a family's pain. But as the family retreated into their private corners, Charles was haunted by voices of the past, and one in particular still burned. Alone, in the dark, King Charles reached for a relic from another time and found no mercy in the words it carried. In the stillness of the night, after the devastating silence with his sons, Charles sought something familiar to steady himself. On a shelf, covered in dust yet perfectly preserved, lay an old cassette recorder. He slid in the tape, pressed play, and the room was immediately filled with the sharp, commanding voice of Prince Philip, his father, his judge. The words were as sharp as the day they were spoken, each syllable biting into his conscience. "You're burning your throne for a woman the public will never forgive." There was no tenderness in Philip's warning, only the cold clarity of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. The accusation echoed, louder than before, now impossible to dismiss. Charles closed his eyes as the memories came flooding back. Diana's laughter, her tears, her quiet moments of despair, Camilla's determined presence, her long shadow stretching into every corner of his life. He felt the weight of every choice he had made, each one sharper than the last, and all of them carving out pieces of himself until nothing seemed left but regret. The love he thought he could justify now felt like a wound he had inflicted not just on Diana, but on his sons, on the monarchy, and on himself. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping rhythmically against the windows of Clarence's house, a mournful symphony to his thoughts. Each drop seemed to echo the judgment already passed upon him by his family, by his people, and by his own conscience. He stared at the tape recorder as if it held all the answers he had never found, but there was no absolution there, only the truth he had avoided. And then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a prayer, he whispered to the empty room, "I never tried hard enough." The words tasted bitter. Admitting them out loud didn't make them any easier to bear. Instead, they seemed to hang there, condemning him further. For the first time in years, he realized that the choices he made in silence could no longer stay hidden. The past was no longer content to remain a shadow. It was rising to meet him, demanding reckoning. But Charles wasn't the only one haunted by old ghosts, because somewhere in the palace, Diana's voice was about to rise again. They thought her story was over, but buried deep in an untouched royal estate was a truth too powerful to remain hidden. It began with what seemed like a routine inventory. Palace staff combed through a forgotten storage room, cataloging decades of royal artifacts left to gather dust. Among stacks of photographs, letters, and forgotten heirlooms, they stumbled upon a small, sealed safe. It took hours to open, but what lay inside would shake the monarchy to its core. Wrapped in faded ribbon, nestled between fragile sheets of paper, was an unpublished memoir, Diana's memoir. What they read was not the carefully curated narrative the public had been fed for years. It was raw, unflinching, brutally honest. Her words tore through the silence with the pain of a woman who had loved deeply and been abandoned even deeper. She wrote not just about the affair or the loneliness, but about the insidious way hope had been dangled in front of her and then ripped away. Each page revealed a side of her story no one had dared to speak. It wasn't just grief, it was betrayal written in her own hand, and the words burned. And then, there it was, the line that would ignite the world. "I don't blame him for loving another, I blame him for letting me believe I had a chance." Those words were more than a confession. They were an indictment, a damning statement, not just about Charles but about the entire institution that had upheld his choices at her expense. It didn't take long for the leak to hit the press. Within hours, it was everywhere. Social media erupted, hashtags spread like wildfire. Number Justice for Diana climbed to the top of trending lists around the globe. News outlets dissected every line, commentators weighed in, and once again, Diana became the voice of the people. Crowds gathered outside palace gates, holding candles that flickered in the night, banners waving with her name and her words. Justice for Diana became more than a slogan, it became a demand. And in that chaos, the monarchy stood cornered. Charles watched the crowds from behind his windows, watched his late wife's words plastered across headlines and screens. He realized, finally and fully, that this was no longer about the past. The world had reopened a wound he had never truly closed. Diana's voice was louder in death than he had ever allowed it to be in life, and now, silence was no longer an option. As Diana's voice grew louder, the monarchy found itself cornered, and Charles knew silence was no longer an option. In Westminster Hall, under the weight of centuries, King Charles stepped into the light to speak words no monarch ever had before. The room, originally prepared to celebrate a royal charity milestone, had become something else entirely. The eyes of the nation, and indeed the world, were upon him. The air was thick with expectation and suspicion, a quiet anticipation of what might come next. Charles stood at the podium, his hands gripping the sides, not out of pride, but out of necessity, as though holding himself upright against the enormity of what he was about to do. When he began to speak, his voice carried not with the confidence of a sovereign, but with the tremor of a man stripped bare. He did not deliver the prepared remarks about philanthropy or duty. Instead, he looked out into the sea of faces, some stern, some tearful, some defiant, and spoke a different truth. Princess Diana deserved more love and respect than she received. For that, I am sorry. The words hung in the hall like a bell tolling for all to hear. Some in the crowd gasped audibly. Others broke into spontaneous applause, while a few simply wept, letting decades of pent-up grief finally surface. But not everyone was moved. For some, the apology rang hollow, too little, too late, a gesture that could never repair what had been broken. The nation was divided, torn between seeing a man finally owning his failures and a king who had allowed those failures to define an entire chapter of history. From the shadows, Camila watched with unmasked fury. For years she had fought for this place at his side, endured the scorn, survived the whispers. But in that single moment, she felt the foundation she had built begin to crack beneath her feet. She could see it in the crowd's eyes, in the headlines already being written. Diana's name was once again on everyone's lips, and Camila, despite everything, was once again the villain of the story. The monarchy itself stood at a crossroads. Redemption glimmered faintly in the distance, but collapse loomed closer than ever. The weight of tradition, of bloodlines and crowns, suddenly felt fragile, as if the whole edifice could shatter at the next revelation. And Charles knew, as he looked out into the hall, that this was no longer about saving himself or even the monarchy. It was about confronting the truths that had been buried for too long, no matter how painful they might be. But while Charles tried to mend the past, Camila plotted her own defense, and someone inside the palace had already betrayed her. While the world debated Charles's apology, Camila received an envelope that sent her world crashing down. For a brief moment, she had believed she could outlast the storm. Though the king's confession to the nation had stung her pride, she told herself it was survivable, that her position was unassailable. But then the envelope arrived, slid across her desk by a nervous aide who could barely meet her eyes. Inside was a printout of a leaked email. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than palace correspondence. But as she read, her face drained of color. The email, written in her own words months earlier, was explicit. She had suggested quietly reducing support for Diana's legacy projects, arguing they distracted from the future of the crown. Worse still, she had advocated limiting William's influence over modernizing the monarchy, describing his ideas as dangerous to stability. The words, once private, now screamed from tabloid headlines within hours. Camila moves against Diana's memory, blared one. Plot to sideline William exposed, cried another. Public outrage erupted instantly. The apology Charles had offered days before, fragile and imperfect, was now drowned by a fresh wave of fury. Protesters outside the gates held banners demanding her removal. Commentators called the leak a betrayal, not just of the family, but of the nation's memory of Diana. The whispers began almost immediately. Who had exposed her? Who inside the palace would dare to strike her like this? Camilla's confidence shattered. The woman who had once weathered decades of scrutiny now found herself unraveling. Those closest to her described the transformation in chilling terms, from composed to frantic, from steely to paranoid in a matter of hours. She demanded answers, demanded names. She accused her aides of betrayal, her advisors of incompetence. No one could calm her, no one dared to try. Behind closed doors, the whispers of conspiracy grew louder. Some said it was William striking back. Others suspected Harry. Still, others wondered if Charles himself had decided she was a liability. And through it all, Camilla's fury deepened. But beneath the rage, one emotion bled through more clearly than any other fear. One advisor later described her as terrified and livid. Not just because her secrets had been exposed, but because whoever had done this had struck with precision, knowing exactly where to wound her most. It was no ordinary betrayal, it was calculated. But the real blow hadn't landed yet because across the ocean, someone was preparing to deliver evidence that would change everything. Under the guise of charity, Harry returned to London carrying a secret that would cut even deeper than his father's confession. His arrival was quiet, deliberate. The press believed he had come to support a cause close to his heart, but in reality, his true mission was far more personal and far more explosive. He requested a private meeting with Charles. No cameras, no aides, just the two of them, father and son, face to face in a room already heavy with unspoken history. Harry didn't waste words. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small USB drive, and placed it on the desk between them. For a moment, Charles simply stared at it, his hand hovering, as though afraid to touch it. Finally, he inserted it into the computer, and the recording began to play. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable, calm, controlled, calculated, Camila. On the tape, she spoke without hesitation, her words slicing through the silence like a knife. Harry and Meghan no longer serve the crown. Continuing their protection is unnecessary. If that puts them at risk, so be it. Every syllable dripped with a cold finality that left no room for misinterpretation. Harry's eyes never left his father. He waited as the weight of the recording sank in, as Charles's face paled and his hands began to tremble. Then, finally, Harry broke the silence. His voice was low but seething with fury. "Did she order that, or did you allow it?" Charles closed his eyes, the shame unmistakable. His reply was barely more than a whisper. "I thought it would keep the peace." But those words fell flat because to Harry, they weren't a justification. They were an admission that his father had stood by while his family's safety was gambled away in a palace power play. The silence that followed was more damning than any outburst. Harry didn't yell. He didn't plead. He simply stood, the air between them charged with a finality that neither of them could undo. There was nothing left to say. But Harry didn't walk out and release the recording to the press. He didn't need to. Instead, he sent it to William with a message that carried all the weight of the past and all the expectation of the future. "You're the only one who can stop her." For the first time, the brothers stood united not just by blood, but by a purpose larger than any crown. When William received Harry's message, the weight of it was immediate and undeniable. The words, "You're the only one who can stop her," lingered in his mind long after he watched the recording that accompanied them. Camilla's voice, cold and unrepentant, echoed through the room as he sat in silence. Yet what struck William most was not the betrayal itself, but the realization that the time for waiting, for hoping the situation would right itself, had passed. He opened a drawer and pulled out something he hadn't dared to touch in years, his mother's diary. The pages still smelled faintly of her perfume, but it wasn't the scent that stopped him, it was her final written words. "If I'm gone, let William start anew, but keep that woman away from my children." It was not just a plea. It was a command. And it was one he could no longer ignore. Beside him, Catherine placed her hand on his and spoke softly but with unshakable conviction. This was not about revenge. It was about protecting the future. Not just their children's future, but the very legacy Diana had fought for, the integrity of the crown, the hope it was supposed to embody, the love it was meant to inspire. Together, they decided they would act. Not as heirs desperate for approval, but as parents determined to protect what was left of their family's soul. They called an extraordinary meeting of the Royal Council. The atmosphere in the chamber was tense, but William's voice was steady as he laid out his vision. A monarchy stripped of old grudges, open to the people, devoted to the causes Diana had championed: mental health, children's welfare, honesty over appearances. And then came the part no one expected but everyone felt coming. Camilla's role would be greatly diminished, her influence quietly removed. Camila, who had been listening in silence until then, could no longer contain herself. Her voice cracked as she stood, eyes blazing with disbelief and rage. "I've sacrificed everything for this family," she cried, her words hanging in the room like an accusation hurled at everyone and no one. But the response she longed for never came. No one moved to defend her, not even Charles. In that moment, it became clear to everyone, including her, that the tide had turned. And as Camila withdrew from public duties, the crown itself began to change in ways no one expected. In the quiet of St. George's Chapel, King Charles made one final gesture, a symbol of remorse, and perhaps of hope. It was not announced. No cameras captured it. But it carried more weight than any speech he had ever given. Charles stood before the royal crown, staring at it not as a symbol of power, but as a monument to everything he had done and everything he had failed to do. Slowly, he reached up and removed the sapphire, the same stone that had once gleamed on Diana's engagement ring, the stone that for decades had reminded the world of her light and his shadow. He placed it in a small box and handed it to William with trembling hands. His words came out in a whisper, yet they filled the entire room. "This is all I can do now. Don't let your apologies come too late, like mine did." It was an admission and a warning all at once, a father's last attempt to leave something behind that could not be tarnished by scandal or silence. That night, he returned to his study and rewrote his will, dedicating a large part of his personal fortune to a foundation in Diana's name, one that would serve children, families, and mental health initiatives around the globe. It was the least he could do, perhaps the only thing he could still do. A year passed, and the monarchy itself began to reflect the change. William and Catherine stepped into their roles not just as heirs, but as leaders with a vision. They opened the palaces to the public more often, launched groundbreaking programs for mental health, and brought the people back to the heart of the institution. The monarchy no longer felt quite as distant or untouchable. It began to look and feel like something worth believing in again. But even as they stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace a year later, flags waving, crowds cheering, cameras flashing, William felt the question that refused to leave him. He leaned slightly toward Catherine and asked quietly, so only she could hear, "Is it enough?" Her response was calm and certain, her eyes fixed on the future they were building together. "We will for your mother, for our children." And as a ray of sunlight touched the crown in that moment, it was clear the story of regret and redemption was only beginning. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.